Okay guys, so to get this gradient effect, the first thing we'll do is press Ctrl J in Mockup 1. Double click. And we'll set the color overlay to black. And OK. Right click, rasterize layer style. And now it's not a smart object anymore. Double click again. And we'll go to the blending options. In advanced options, we'll set the fill opacity to 0%. Let's apply a gradient overlay. And usually we'd use something like this. Now let's double click. And we're going to choose a black tone for this side here. So we get that shadow effect. We'll give the white color a 0% opacity. The black color has 100% opacity. And we'll move the white to around here. So we get some black here, then a bit of white, and then a transparency at the end. Just move it a bit more this way. If we move the gradient, then see how it changes. So this here is the transparency, the opacity. So this is for the colors, and the top part is for the opacity. So I'm moving this slider here closer. And that's why now at the end it's totally transparent. There's no white or black. And OK. Now set the opacity here to 35%. And you see how with this gradient we applied, we get this shadow effect. So let's press Ctrl J in Mockup 2. Double click to go to Layer Style and Color Overlay Black. OK. Right click, Rasterize Layer Style. Double click again to go to Blending Options. And we'll set the fill opacity in the advanced blending to 0%. And again, we'll apply a gradient overlay. Obviously, it now has to have the reverse effect. So click here on Reverse. OK. And we'll lower the opacity again to 35%. Now see how we get this white gradient here and this dark area that makes the fold in the brochure more visible. If we increase the opacity a little, it's even more visible. I think I'll leave it at 40%. And I'll do the same for the other side. You can always make whatever adjustments you think are suitable for the design. Now, it's important our workspace is tidy so we don't get lost, so we should keep our layers organized and named appropriately. So double-click on our gradient layer, and we'll rename it to Mockup 1 Gradient. And we'll rename the other one to Mockup 2 Gradient. Now, what we'll do is apply a slight blur to the sides of the brochure. This is something optional, as the presentation is already looking quite decent. So again, Ctrl J in Mockup 1. And we'll change the name to Mockup 1 Blur. Now, remember that we rasterized the gradient, but we're not going to rasterize the blur because it needs to remain as a smart object. This smart object is the same as the one below because it's been duplicated. So when I replace an image in this smart object in Mockup 1, Then the image will automatically adjust in the Smart object in Mockup Blur. So let's go to Blur, and we're going to apply a filter. So go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And we'll set this to 1 pixel. And OK. As this is a Smart object, we can also edit the Smart filters if you double-click on them. We'll now create a layer mask on the Mockup Blur layer. So the areas we want the blur to disappear from, we need to paint in black. So see here how the mask is completely white. The whole area is blurred. But if we paint something in black, then this part of the blur will disappear. And we'll use the paintbrush to do this. So we need to select the paintbrush tool. For some reason, when I'm recording on screen, you can't see the circle that usually appears when you choose the paintbrush tool. But we'll select the brush tool and we'll right-click, and we'll change the size to 280 pixels, and we'll leave the hardness at 0. Okay, so I'm going to apply the brush from this area all over this middle part here. So, as I said, on my screen you can't see the circle that usually appears when you use this tool, but you should be able to see it on yours. So we're going to apply the brush to this area here. As the brush has 0% hardness, it will also have a kind of gradient itself, so it won't be too hard or too abrupt. It will be quite soft. So now let's go to the brush tool and click. Remember, it's important that the mask is selected, so select the layer mask. Click here, and see how we can now start to see what's behind the blur. So keep clicking and see the effect we end up with. So I'm going to do the same now with Mockup 2. Ctrl J, rename it to Mockup 2, Blur, apply a Gaussian blur, 1.0 pixels, apply a layer mask, and I'm going to do the same thing with the brush tool. I'm going to apply it to all this area here. As I said before, you might not be able to see on my screen the circle that indicates the brush tool is activated, but you should be able to see it on your screen. So we need to click around here and all over this area so we can see it through the blur effect. So let's select the brush once again. Make sure the layer mask is selected by clicking on it. And remember that when we paint, it needs to be black. If you use white, then nothing will happen. Okay, so let's click. And you can see how the image from behind comes through the blur. So I've applied the brush to all this area. And we get that blurred effect on the edges. So let's go to Mockup 1 Gradient and double click. I've done that because I can see this fine white strip down the middle, which I'll move a bit, as it makes the fold of the brochure stand out. So because we used the paintbrush in our layer masks, you can see the brushstrokes here on the thumbnail. If we make a mistake, we can simply erase it by going to the eraser tool, and we can just erase the areas where we didn't mean to paint. So let's just hide this layer so we can appreciate this effect. So here you see it's without the blur. And if we click here on the eye, you can see the light blur on the edge of the brochure. Now the last thing we're going to add is a small shadow on the bottom, a cast shadow. So we'll create a new layer and we'll place it above the original background. And we'll rename it to bottom shadow or lower shadow. With the brush tool, we'll apply a few strokes to the lower part of the brochure. So let's select the brush tool and we'll choose a black tone. Let's right-click and we'll set the size to 200 pixels and we'll leave the hardness again at 0. And we'll click here just like this. I'll just carry on clicking around here. And you can see the shadows start to appear. Okay, I want to erase some from the sides here. Before I do that, I'll just add some more shadow here. So select the eraser tool and right-click. We'll keep the size at 200 pixels and the hardness at 0. If we put the hardness to 100%, then you can see that if we click, the cut is very abrupt. So Ctrl Z to undo that. And again, right-click and we'll set the hardness back to 0. So I'll start applying it here on the left and see how the shadows start to disappear. I'll also go over to the right side. Okay. Now, for the lower shadow, I'll press Ctrl T and I'll move it upwards like this. More or less around here. And OK. But see how on the left here the cut is very abrupt. So I'll just take the eraser and I'll erase this bit a little bit to get rid of that effect. And I'm going to set the opacity of this shadow to 35%. And now you can see how the shadow gives the design a more realistic look. So here it is without the shadow, and here with. If you want to add some more emphasis to the shadow, you can press Ctrl J, then Ctrl T, and we can adjust this, we can make it smaller. Okay. And this is the effect that you get. Okay, so our mockup template is finished and ready to use for any design you create with this kind of format. So in this case, a double-sided brochure with an A4 size. You can use this commercially, you can use it to promote your work, present your projects, even for your own portfolio, for instance. You can also use them to make them available for download. So if you double-click on Mockup 1, you can make adjustments. For example, I can rotate the image like this. Ctrl S to save. And now when I go back, the image on my template has changed. And that is how easy it is. Ctrl Z to undo. And now you can start to design your own templates for whatever you like. You could use things you have lying around at home, like brochures or leaflets. You can take a photo of them and you can convert them into a mock-up, just as we did here. So that's all for now. Join me on the final lesson of this course where I'll give you some tips of how to arrange your mock-ups in order to present them. So I'll see you there.